Let's travel back about 15 years, to a time when I was only 20 years old. I remember it so vividly, as if the fragments of that year refused to fade, etched permanently into the contours of my mind. I was entering my final year of college, poised on the brink of what I believed would be the life my family and I had always imagined for me. It was autumn, I think, late September or early October, and the air on campus had begun to carry that crisp, leafy scent of the new season. I was an athlete, a solid member of my college's baseball team, with a respectable batting average and a shot at making first string for the final season. My grades were top-notch, my GPA high enough to please even the most exacting of mentors, and the path ahead seemed straightforward. Business school, or maybe law school after graduation. That was the family tradition after all. My uncles were lawyers or businessmen, my cousins followed suit, and the expectation was that I would gracefully slide into that mold, continuing the family legacy. My parents were proud people, intellectual and driven. From the time I was small, they had gently guided my energies toward leadership, achievement, discipline. They encouraged me to study hard, swing for the fences both literally and metaphorically, and follow the well-trodden path toward professional and financial stability. Extended family gatherings were always filled with talk of mergers, acquisitions, caseloads, trials, and new legal precedents. Discussions about taxes, trusts, and business strategies were the norm. To that end, I fit in comfortably, if not entirely enthusiastically. Life felt good, stable, and promising. One afternoon, after a grueling baseball practice, I headed into the locker room. The day had gone smoothly. A good practice session, a mock scrimmage where I'd scored a run, and the easy banter between teammates that left me feeling confident and connected. My life, at 20, felt like a new car right off the assembly line. Clean, shiny, and ready to go anywhere. When I finally retrieved my phone from my locker, my stomach lurched. The screen displayed hundreds of missed calls and texts, filling the memory. The texts ranged from frantic, "Pick up now," to the more disturbing, "You monster," and "We know what you did." Every message seemed hysterical, radiating panic. I stood there, blinking, sweat still cooling on my temples. Confused, I tried to rationalize it as a prank, perhaps some cruel team initiation or a friend's idea of humor. But the sheer quantity of calls and texts from both family and friends made that theory collapse almost instantly. I stepped outside, ignoring curious glances from a few teammates. The autumn sun hung lower now, casting long shadows across the campus quad. My heart hammered as I scrolled through the barrage of messages. I decided to call my mother first. If anyone could explain this madness, it was her. I pressed the call button. She answered after one ring, but her response was nothing like I expected. On the other end, I heard screaming, an animalistic howl of rage and betrayal. Her words were nearly indecipherable, laced with sobs and outrage. Shocked, I tried to calm her, tried to say, "Mom, what's happening?" But before I could form a coherent question, my uncle's voice cut through the line, and then suddenly, as if conjured from thin air, the man himself appeared in front of me on campus grounds. He had driven to me directly, skipping any pretense, and he was furious. He rushed forward, punching me square in the face before I even had time to think. The force of the blow shattered my nose. Pain burst like fireworks behind my eyes. He screamed that he was going to kill me. I remember stumbling backward, blood pouring from my nose, confusion pulsing in my ears. My father, who must have come with him, wrestled my uncle away, telling me in a voice I barely recognized to get home. Now. Dizzy, disoriented, I stumbled to my old van, the one my parents had gifted me to transport baseball gear and occasionally some furniture for friends moving apartments. I drove back to my childhood home, the place I'd grown up with warm Christmases, Thanksgivings loaded with food and laughter, and a general sense of familial love. The drive was surreal. My vision blurred from the pain in my nose and the tears welling up in my eyes. Why had my uncle struck me? Why were my mother and father enraged? Words like monster still echoed in my head, but they made no sense. When I arrived, I found the entire extended family gathered. A tense silence hung in the air, punctuated by my mother's screaming. My uncle shouted to call the cops while I stood there uncomprehending. My mother kept asking, "Why did you do it? And how could you?" Over and over again, I shouted back, begging them to explain what was happening. Finally, the revelation fell like a hammer. My cousin Amy, only 12 years old at the time, had claimed I'd assaulted her during a 4th of July party earlier that year. That day, I was supposedly at the family gathering, hurting a child I adored as my own little sister. I denied it, of course. Shocked, I shouted that it couldn't be true, that I was innocent. But my protestations were met with disbelief, with sneers, with accusations. They refused to hear me. My father, whom I'd always seen as my protector, who taught me how to throw a ball and tie a tie, suddenly struck me in the gut. As I doubled over, winded, he told me to leave and never come back. He tossed out my clothes in garbage bags as if I were trash. In that moment, my universe collapsed. The family that had once been my foundation turned against me as swiftly as lightning, without trial or question. I was cast into the cold unknown, exiled from everything I had known and loved. Confused, hurt, and utterly lost, I called a few teammates, who thankfully let me crash on a sofa that night. I tried calling my parents repeatedly, trying to reason with them, trying to remind them who I was. They never answered. A week later, a single text from my father made it clear. "Leave us alone. You're a monster. Rot in hell." That message extinguished any last flicker of hope that this was all a misunderstanding. Time became an enemy. In the ensuing weeks, the university contacted me about tuition fees due. My parents, who had been helping finance my education, were now completely unreachable. I was blocked from their accounts, from their emotional and financial support. I had little savings, and so I made the toughest choice of my life. I gave up baseball, the sport that had been my passion and a major component of my identity. Overnight, I became a full-time worker and a part-time student, cobbling together whatever shifts I could, often the overnight ones, just to pay the bills. I lived in my van as the seasons changed. The winter in my part of the country was brutal. Nights dipped well below freezing. My breath condensed inside the van's windows. Often I wore every piece of clothing I owned just to stave off hypothermia. I bought cheap blankets from thrift shops, but they did little good. Still, I persevered and managed to graduate. On graduation day, there was no family waiting in the crowd to cheer for me, no celebratory dinner afterward. After I picked up my diploma, I sat alone in that old van and cried, shoulders shaking, the future a black void. In my despair, I found temporary relief in whiskey and later in drugs. They dulled the ache, blurred the memories, helped me forget that the people who raised me had cast me out like a diseased animal. I began bouncing from one dead-end job to another. I refused to trust anyone, especially around children. I avoided parks, schools, anywhere kids might be. Just seeing a child caused me to panic, reminding me of the accusation that had ruined my life. The seasons turned into years. My mental health deteriorated. I considered that maybe I was indeed a monster. Everyone else believed it after all. Why not me? My van eventually gave out. The engine died after a particularly brutal winter night. Without heat or a working vehicle, I was more exposed than ever. I scavenged for food, for water, sleeping behind dumpsters or in abandoned buildings. I lived in constant fear of being attacked or mugged. I lived in filth and desperation. Every night, I dreamed of my old life, the pristine baseball diamond, the smiling faces of my parents, the aroma of home-cooked meals, and my father's proud grin when I brought home good grades. Waking each morning was torture, the dreams only reminding me of what I'd lost. Eventually, I reached the end of my endurance. 2 years had passed since my expulsion from the family sphere, and I was hollowed out. One evening, I climbed the fire escape of an apartment complex, up to its roof. Standing near the edge, I looked down at the distant asphalt, the tiny cars and miniature people below. I remember thinking, if I jump, no one would care. No one would come looking for me. At least I would be free from this relentless pain. I pulled out my phone, ancient and battered. and stared at it, praying silently that maybe my mother or father would call, that maybe they'd say, "It was all a mistake. Come home." But the phone was silent. My tears blurred the city lights. Taking a deep breath, I prepared to step off that ledge and find peace in oblivion. Then I heard a voice behind me. "Stop!" A woman's voice, clear and urgent. Surprised, I turned. A young woman ran toward me, her face a mixture of fear and concern. She pleaded, tears glistening in her eyes, for me to climb down, to step away from the edge. Her sincerity disarmed me. She offered her hand, begging me not to do this. In that moment, it felt as though some gentle spirit took hold of me. Against all my instincts, I reached out. She guided me down, where I collapsed in sobs. Soon, EMTs arrived and took me to a hospital. I spent 2 days there, heavily sedated, my mind whirling with confusion and regret at what I had almost done. When they released me, I stepped out into the chilly sunlight, drained and directionless. And there she was, this woman who had saved me. She approached, worry etched across her face. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. I could barely manage a reply. "No," I said, my voice cracking. She asked if I had family, and I said no. Did I have anywhere to go? Again, no. Did I need food? I shook my head. Her persistence baffled me, but she wouldn't give up. "You can't just go back on the streets. Come over to my place, I'll make you dinner," she said. When I asked why, genuinely puzzled, she just replied, "Because you look like you need a friend." Something in her tone, kind, determined, broke through my defenses. I mumbled an okay, and let her lead me away. Her name was Rachel. She was 22, only a couple of years younger than I, but seemed so much wiser and calmer. She lived in a modest apartment filled with books, artwork, and a warmth that I instantly recognized as compassion. It felt like stepping into a museum curated by kindness. She cooked pasta that night, simple and hearty, and we talked for hours, though I avoided my past, skirting around it like a wounded animal. She didn't pry too deeply, just gave me space. I slept on her couch that night, wrapped in blankets that smelled of lavender detergent instead of mildew. For 3 weeks, Rachel helped me get back on my feet. She even got me a job at her father's company working the front desk. She gave me rides to work, prepared my meals, and introduced me slowly to a world I'd forgotten existed, a world where people could be kind for no reason. During those weeks, I gave up drinking and flushed the drugs down the toilet. Cold turkey was hellish, but Rachel never left me alone. She would sit by me during the night tremors and panic attacks, offering a steady hand on my shoulder. Slowly, the haze lifted, and I began to see myself as someone who might still have a future. I told Rachel I would look for my own place soon. After everything she had done, I didn't want to overstay my welcome. But when I mentioned leaving, she looked genuinely pained. "Why are you so nice to me?" I demanded one evening, overwhelmed by gratitude and shame. I started yelling and crying at the same time, my voice cracking as I told her I didn't deserve her kindness. She tried to hug me, and I pulled away, convinced I was tainted. She pleaded with me to stay until I saw a therapist. I was so rattled by the mere suggestion that I ended up walking in tight circles in her living room, muttering nonsense. Eventually, exhausted, I said yes. Over the next 4 weeks, I visited a therapist that Rachel paid for out of her own pocket. I didn't spill everything at once, but I talked enough to realize that I needed to heal, to release the bitterness. Each session peeled back a layer of my trauma. I stopped seeing myself solely as a victim of a monstrous injustice and began to view my life as something I could still salvage. Sometime later, Rachel invited me to her parents' house for her father's birthday. Entering a family home again churned up painful memories. I remembered how my own family celebrations used to feel. Laughter, abundant food, inside jokes. Now I was terrified. In Rachel's family living room, relatives chatted about everyday matters, teased each other, and raised toasts. They asked me friendly questions about where I was from, my family, what I did. Eventually, under their gentle but persistent curiosity, I snapped. I poured out the truth in a torrent of words, my cousin's false accusation, My family's immediate condemnation, my father's blows, my subsequent descent into homelessness and despair, I concluded bitterly that no one would ever believe my innocence, and that I was destined to walk this earth alone. By the time I finished, I was shaking, tears blurring my vision. I wanted to run, to leave their warm home where I did not belong. I bolted for the door, expecting rage or judgment, but Rachel's father, John, gently caught my shoulder. I flinched, waiting to be hit, but no blow came. Instead, he spoke softly. "Son, I look into people's eyes for a living." He was in human resources and did a lot of interviews, Rachel had mentioned. He said he could see the truth in my eyes and that they wanted to help me, not hurt me. I fell into his arms, sobbing harder than I had in years. The entire family gathered around, comforting me. In that moment, I understood that not all families would abandon or hate me. Some would extend a hand, even when it was shaking in confusion, simply because compassion demanded it. Over the next few years, my life accelerated in a direction I'd never dreamed possible. Rachel and I grew closer, fell in love, and married. Her father, Phil, whose name I finally learned properly, helped me apply to business school. With the stability they provided, I excelled academically. I eventually got a job at Phil's company, working my way up. The first time I bought a car, and later a house, I felt a sense of triumph that brought tears to my eyes. I had been sober for 7 years, and my nightmares had receded to occasional whispers. Rachel and I were expecting our first child, a baby boy. Therapy had become a regular part of my routine, twice a month, helping me unpack the scars of the past and learn healthier coping strategies. I devoted myself to treating Rachel like the queen she was. She had saved my life, after all, not just physically on that rooftop, but spiritually and emotionally. She had reminded me that I could love and trust again. Life began to feel not only tolerable, but good. I cherished quiet mornings sipping coffee with her, weekend walks, and the feeling of a home filled with gentle laughter. Then came the call that threatened to throw my equilibrium into chaos. I was sitting in my office when my phone rang. Without checking the caller ID, I answered. "Hello?" I said, expecting a client or a coworker. Instead, I heard a trembling voice. "Opie, is that you?" My childhood nickname, spoken by my mother. Shocked, I nearly dropped the phone. My heart hammered as she tried to speak. "It's Mom," she said. I hung up immediately, my hand shaking. Waves of conflicting emotions crashed over me. All those years of silence, and now this. The phone rang again. I refused to answer. I texted Rachel to come. She rushed over from her office, holding me while I tried to calm my breathing. My phone blew up with calls and texts. This time, however, the messages were different. They were filled with apologies, pleas for forgiveness. One message from my mother stood out. It said that Amy, now 19, had confessed. She had admitted to lying about the assault all those years ago. She had told the family the truth. It never happened. They were sorry, they said. They wanted to speak, to see me, to make it right. They claimed they loved me, had always loved me, but had been misguided, trying to protect a child. I was stunned. The world tilted under my feet. For 2 weeks, I agonized over what to do. Therapy became daily. I needed guidance. My wife helped me practice what I might say if I met them, how I could maintain my composure. Finally, I agreed to meet my parents. I chose a coffee shop, neutral ground, public enough that I could leave easily if things got heated. I insisted that only my mother and father come, no other family members. On the scheduled day, Rachel and I arrived early. When my parents walked in, they rushed toward me, arms outstretched, but Rachel stepped between us. "No hugs, please," she said firmly. "Sit down." I sat there, a Coke in my hand, chewing on ice as they began to speak. Their voices shook. They explained that a few weeks ago, Amy had called a family meeting. She confessed to lying about the assault, admitting that she'd sought attention and sympathy. She had been rewarded handsomely for her false claims. Trips to Disney World, lavish gifts, a car, money, the love and care of a family that closed ranks around her. She never considered how this lie would destroy my life. I asked why I never got to tell my side. They talked about fear, anger, and the instinct to protect a child. They admitted they were caught up in the moment, acting on emotion. My father apologized for hitting me. He said he was angry and confused back then. My mother's eyes brimmed with tears. I asked them if they remembered that I wasn't even at the 4th of July party in question. I'd been out of state for a baseball game. They froze, their faces twisting in shock. They'd never bothered to confirm my whereabouts. I showed them a photo from that day. Me and my teammates celebrating a game-winning hit in another city. They looked physically ill. I pressed on, my voice icy. Why was my tuition canceled? Why were my meal plans revoked? My mother looked puzzled. She said she believed they had kept supporting me. My father looked guilty and admitted he diverted the funds to his brother, Amy's father, helping finance their trips and luxuries. My mother screamed at him, horrified. I laid out every detail of my shattered life, sleeping in a van, losing my scholarship-level opportunities in baseball, working brutal shifts, freezing and starving, spiraling into alcoholism and drugs, nearly committing suicide. My story spilled out, raw and unapologetic. And as I spoke, people at neighboring tables fell silent, listening with horrified faces. When I asked what Amy's punishment would be, they stumbled. They said she would have to apologize, maybe try to make it up to me. I pressed them. Would she live in a van for 2 years, be disowned, suffer publicly? Would she reimburse me for the stolen tuition money, buy me trips and cars as I had to forfeit mine? They balked, saying she was young, had her whole life ahead of her. They didn't want to ruin her future. Isn't that exactly what you did to me? I demanded. When I was young and had my whole life ahead of me, you ruined it. But now it's different for her? They couldn't answer. They tried to plead with me, to say that it was complicated, that they made a mistake. I laughed bitterly. So you made me into a monster in your minds, and now that the truth is out, you expect a happy family reunion. I stood up, shaking with emotion. You lost your son 7 years ago, I said. He is gone. Move on, just as you did for all those years without him. My mother sobbed. My father looked broken. Rachel took my hand, and we walked out, leaving them weeping at the table. It felt both hollow and liberating. I had confronted them with the truth, forced them to face the reality of their actions, and refused to absolve them with a neat apology. In the years since, I occasionally receive calls and messages from my family, attempts to rebuild a bridge they burned to ash. On social media, I see that Amy went to college, financed on her own this time, driving a beat-up car from the 1990s. The luxuries were stripped away, but still, her life goes on comfortably enough. It's not the punishment some might consider just, but vengeance doesn't interest me anymore. I care about my peace, my family, Rachel and our child. I am still healing. I have a therapist whom I see regularly. Some days, I feel the old anger simmering, but I have learned to manage it, to let it go drop by drop. I love my wife and child fiercely. I cherish every quiet morning with them, every celebration we host in our home. I have built a new life from the wreckage, and in doing so, I discovered I am stronger than I ever imagined. I survived their betrayal. I survived cruelty, homelessness, addiction, despair. I found salvation in the kindness of a stranger who became my life partner, and in the warm acceptance of a new family that taught me not all people will abandon you when things get hard. I haven't seen my birth family face to face since that coffee shop encounter. Maybe one day I'll be ready to hear them out again, to learn more about how they have atoned, if they've learned anything. But not now. Healing is a slow process, and trust, once shattered, cannot be reconstructed overnight. For now, I keep my distance. I have my new family, my new career, and my future. I don't need them to define my worth or my identity anymore. If there's anything I've learned, it's that life can swing like a wrecking ball, smashing your world apart in seconds. But resilience is real too. Healing can come from unexpected sources, and love can blossom even in the scorched earth of past heartbreaks. I've learned that you can't force justice in every sense, and sometimes you must create your own peace. I've learned to let go of the impossible desire that my old family might truly understand the magnitude of what they did. Whether they understand or not is no longer my burden. I will continue to move forward. I will continue to heal, to celebrate the good things I have now. And as for my past, I have transformed it from a gaping wound into a scar, a reminder of what I overcame, a testament to my strength and the power of compassion from people who owe you nothing but give you everything. Time, therapy, and love have shown me that I deserve happiness, that I am not defined by false accusations or the small-mindedness of those who refuse to trust me. I am defined by my choices, my resilience, and by the people I choose to love and protect. That is enough. It has to be enough. And day by day, it becomes more than enough. It becomes everything.